Welcome to Feminist Question Time, brought to you by Women's Human Rights Campaign, which is the leading global organisation defending women's sex-based rights against threats posed by gender identity ideology. There's more information on our website, womensdeclaration.com, where you will find our declaration on women's sex-based rights, which has been signed by 20,800 people from 140 countries and is supported by 386 organisations. We have country contacts in 52 countries engaged in defending women's sex-based rights. If you'd like to get involved, go onto the website and there's a form you can fill in to say you'd like to do that. This week, Feminist Question Time, we have Amparo Domingo from Spain. She's the country contact for Women's Human Rights Campaign from Spain. She's going to give us an update on what's happening in Spain. We have Tania Sturt from New Zealand. She's going to talk about taking it to the NZ streets. We have Dansky from the USA, who has published a new book, which was out midweek, so it's now available. She's going to talk to us about that book. It's called The Abolition of Sex, How the Transgender Agenda Harms Women and Girls. And Sal Grover, who hasn't yet arrived on the panel. She's made an app and has had problems, a women-only app, and she's going to talk about female spaces are necessary. I'd like to introduce our first panelist, who is Amparo Domingo. She's the Women's Human Rights Campaign country contact for Spain. She's going to give us an update on what's happening in Spain. So welcome, Amparo, and over to you.
I'm here today to tell you about the situation in Spain. As Marina Terrani very kindly advanced last week, it's getting very complicated for us women. Our government is really pushing very, very hard to enshrine gender identity in Spanish law. So what I'm going to tell you is not so different from what we hear here every week. Gender identity ideology is spreading very deeply in our government and official bodies. What might be different in our case in Spain is that we feminists are aware of what's going on. We're fighting it and making some noise, so people are starting to wake up and notice the real agenda, which means that not everything is bad news. The upside is that we're creating and enhancing feminist networks. We are connecting with feminists from all over the country and making some noise already. No matter what might happen, though we hope we will win this war, I'm sure these women-only networks will have an influence in the near future. So I'm going to tell you next about the specific details of the situation in Spain. After a couple of drafts were leaked to the press at the beginning of the year, the Spanish government approved last June 29th a draft for a law that, in case of becoming an actual law, would have all three axes of gender ideology in one legal document. It has quite a long name, as you see. It's a draft bill for the real and effective equality of trans people and for the protection of the rights of LGBTI people. But everyone informally here refers to it as the trans law, even though it's not a law yet, as I said, and we hope it will never will. Those three axes are, as you can see on your screen, self-ID, for every Spaniard over 14 years old. Specifically, what the proposed text says is that just by declaring so, it would be possible to get a rectification of the mention of sex on the registry, something that would have legal effect for all purposes. And that's because sex is the data recorded in Spain. Gender as such is not a legal category at all. The second important thing included in that draft is the prohibition by law of any non-affirmative approach to perceived identities. That is, the only thing you can do is enthusiastically affirm everyone that says they're trans, and this includes a specific banning on so-called conversion therapies, which, as we all know, could in fact criminalize therapists dealing with dysphoric patients, and also a consideration of non-affirming parents as dangerous for the well-being of their children, therefore being at risk of losing legal custody for that reason. As you see, there's an asterisk there. I will explain that later. The third axis in this law is the criminalization of dissent. We call it a gag law. which fines up to 150,000 euros for the new crime of LGBTI phobia, which is not explained anywhere in the draft. As if that weren't enough, what makes the situation even worse is that gender identity is mentioned in many drafts or laws that are currently being written or modified in Spain. For instance, as you can see, at the organic law on education, at the law for the comprehensive protection of children and adolescents from violence against them, commonly known as the Rose Law. As you see, there's the same asterisks because that consideration of when parents are non-affirming their children, that could be considered a risk for children. And that has been reframed as a form of violence, and parents could lose custody of their children for that. So that provision was included in this other law, not only at the trans law, and it's now enforced, so could be enforced by trans activists at some point. We also have 44 regional laws on public health and education, and most of them include self-ID in those specific areas. There are other proposals that would include gender identity, is the draft bill for sports and the bill for the organic law on full guarantee of sexual freedom. That's about sexual violence against women. So in all this legal text, they include gender identity and the obligation of respecting that gender identity. I can be sure that this is the whole list. There might be other cases we're not yet aware of, you know, how they work. So now I'm going to show you some of the highlights, so to say, of our work, government and society from 2021. This is something that happened some months ago in March. As we all know, March 8th is an important date for feminists all over the world. And this year, to commemorate International Women's Day, the Ministry for Equality chose a trans-identified male to read a statement on sisterhood, speaking about all women, and when they say so, for them, it means including men in that category. The ministry's decision was described by the press as a challenge for us feminists. Later on, in June, this is for us also from our Ministry for Equality, they chose to celebrate Pride in a very peculiar way. They hired a choir to perform on their garden on June 28th, and they sang something called, believe me, I'm going to show you, Mundo Binario Cis Heteropatriarcal, which in English would be Cis Heteropatriarchal Binary World. And I'm going to show you just some seconds of it. This is a real video, not a parody. Mundo binario cis heteropatriarcal. Mundo binario cis heteropatriarcal. ¿Qué demonios significará? Mundo binario cis heteropatriarcal. Mundo binario cis heteropatriarcal. The conservative media said that it was the ministry's new anthem. And really, this thing was paid with taxpayers' money. September 1st, our Minister for Equality tweeted from her official Twitter account some pictures of a working meeting with experts on obstetric violence. She said those meetings were held in the framework of a future reform of the Spanish abortion law that the government wants to carry out. We have to take into account that the official name of that piece of legislation is Organic Law on Sexual and Reproductive Health and the Voluntary Interruption of Pregnancy. So we're quite suspicious about the intentions of the ministry, since, as you can see, Irene Montero was wearing a mask with the trans flag on it for that meeting. And she wore that mask again a month later for the official commemoration of National Day of Spain, October 12th. Just last week, last Friday, November 5th, the Minister for Public Health signed an order to allow all women, and in this case, it's only females, to access assisted reproduction services because some years ago, 2014, the right-wing party in government restricted those services only to straight women who had actual fertility issues. That is, the previous order excluded from these treatments any women that was not in a heterosexual relationship. So now single mothers and lesbians can access those services too, which is good. But the wording of the whole thing reflects the ideological capture of a government, because it says it includes trans people who could get pregnant, who of course are women. Meanwhile, that very same Friday, on November 5th, last week, the Minister for Equality, she was chairing an event about the legal gender recognition in Spain, organized in coordination with the Council of Europe. The wording of this roundtable is very interesting because, as I said, gender is not a legal category in Spain. Only biological sex is recorded. So they're trying to move probably to the recognition of gender because they haven't been able to include non-binary people in the aforementioned draft for the trans law, something that is of a great concern to trans activists. So they discussed this thing that they were not able to include the non-binary people in this roundtable, and where you can see they had the president of our organization of non-binaries with the minister. It's impossible to tell what sex this person is, as you see. And there were other trans activists in that event, but I'm going to highlight Marina Echevarria, who's now on the screen, because of his intervention as the president of the LGBTI Participation Council. That's an advisory body created by the ministry to give these trans activists an official voice in public matters, such as the creation of new regulations or guidelines from our government. Echevarria is AGP, married, father of two, which means that now a straight male is the president of the Spanish LGBTI Participation Council. We're about to finish this part of the presentation with a look at the mass media. Left-wing leaning media have completely capitulated to gender ideology. Outlets like El Diario, La Marea, El Salto Diario, Contexto, all of them have become trans activists themselves and are very partial in their articles about this issue, very clearly favoring the woke approach. The examples I'm going to show you, this and next slide, are from a very big communication group, Grupo Prisa, which traditionally has been considered very close to the Socialist Party and are quite influential in left-wing Spanish people. This first example is from a very important progressive radio network, Cadena SER, who invited a trans-identified male as a part of their celebration of International Women's Day last March. This is a male in his 50s, he's clearly AGP as well, who transitioned 5 years ago after a very successful career in the corporate world and who now wants to be a champion for women's rights at the end, a champion for the advancement of women in business, all that by substituting us, which makes no sense at all. The second example is from the newspaper El País, a very big name, not only in Spain, but also in Latin America. And this is from their fashion supplement, Es Moda. They wanted to celebrate the 10 years of the launch of the Occupy movement, which was the seed from which the woke party Podemos arose. And they gathered 8 women for this piece. I should say 8 women. You'll see that I drew some arrows in the picture, and I guess you can guess why. Sorry. The article is really something because it's full of lies. But in order to be brief, I want to focus on this remarkable picture where they've included 4 males and 4 females. You can know who the males are by the arrows. So El País are so down with the mantra, trans women are women, that they didn't dare to have an article on women with just women. So they had to include men. But not only that, women couldn't be the majority of the women in the article. So they've reached a very weird new idea of parity. So they had as many men as women in that article about women. I think this is mind-blowing. Some final thoughts on this picture. As you might notice, only men look straight into the camera. Women don't. So many other things happened this year, but I think these examples come since they come from the sources of power and legislation and sources of public opinion. They seemed illustrative enough for you to get an idea of the current atmosphere here. But I don't want to depress you. I told you there's an upside to this story. The situation is very serious, as you can see, but it's not desperate. We still hope we can turn the tide. So that here, there are some good news from Spain. Though not as frequent nor ubiquitous as the presence of trans activists in media, some are beginning to pay attention to the transitioners. It's more likely that they will appear in conservative media, as this case, but at least it gets the stories of men and women saying that believing in stereotypes made them think they were trans. And in this interview, this male, who is homosexual, he, after getting the vaginoplasty and all of that, has come to the conclusion that the trans business is pure homophobia and that transsexuality is homophobia. This summer, as we all know, there was the story of Laurel Hubbard competing with women at the Tokyo Olympics, and the Spanish Federation of Weightlifting was not happy about it, and they said so loud and clear through the president, Constantino Iglesias, who you have here in the slide, who said that it was unfair for women because Hubbard was stronger and bigger. And this was in the Spanish media. There are some things going on in sports, so it's interesting that the story is already there. So I don't think it's going to be a surprise for you at this point to know that feminists in Spain have had a pretty busy year. Starting with feminists from brave feminists from the woke parties that form the coalition that is pushing very hard for the changes in legislation. Women from those parties collected signatures against the trans law already in March, coinciding with International Women's Day, which was an honorable thing for them to do. Then, some weeks ago, feminists inside one of the two main workers' unions in Spain won an incredible victory inside that union when they prevented the endorsement of self-ID policies and made the union agree to learn about the impact of those policies on women's rights and equality policies. It was a great moment from them and a lighthouse for other women in other unions. As I've said at the beginning of this presentation, we feminists have been making some noise too. Women Human Rights Campaign is a proud member of Confluencia Movimiento Feminista, with whom we organized June 26 rallies in 20 cities all over Spain to voice our opposition to the draft bill. We were featured in some media, which started visibilizing our position for a wider audience. This picture here, this is Barcelona, this picture is Madrid, and this at the left is Valencia. And some weeks ago, last month, there was a demonstration in Madrid, which we didn't organize, which is good too, because it means we're growing in numbers. And this demonstration was against the neoliberal agenda for government, but there were a great number of women protesting against trans law as well. There was this funny banner that you see here at the bottom of the slide. It went viral. It said, "I don't care about your pronouns, Manolo." And that inspired all sorts of memes like this one you have at the bottom right of the slide, which is something someone made up with the slogan, "Manolo's rights are human rights." So we continue working to increase awareness on this matter. And next week, our feminist sisters of DOFENCO, Feminist Teachers for Co-Education, will have their first international conference on gender identity ideology in the classroom. Speakers won't be only from Spain, but also from other countries, such as the UK, Canada, United States, Argentina, in order to denounce the different array of consequences this ideology is having in children, in young people, and on the teacher professors themselves. So that's all for the time being, which means that we're going to keep on working to fight this misogynistic ideology that wants to erase us from the law and public spaces. We won't give up, we won't submit, they shall not pass. Thank you very much.
In your opinion, what should we focus on at this time so that the trans laws are not passed And how do you think we can support so that the trans laws are not passed in Spain from abroad? So how would people from abroad help?
Yeah, well, I think so far the best way we have found, as you all know, is raising awareness. Because as many of you are familiar with the Denton's report, so they were advising that you shouldn't tell people what's really your motivation. You should tie your cause to more popular ones and not explain too much, because they say that people wouldn't understand it, but that's a way of keeping people in the dark. When we explain these things, and when we explain all ramifications of this ideology, as Cara is doing in her book, it's not about I just want to pee, I want to use the bathroom. Is the statistics, is the sex segregated spaces, prisons, everything is in danger with this ideology. So raising awareness is very important. And I understand that the most difficult part so far is also raising awareness within people that have a power of influencing other people. So that's, I think we should try to aim to talk to people in power, to female MPs, to journalists, because some of them, well, we have seen what happened to J.K. Rowling, but some people really, they have a platform and they can make a lot of impact. So I think we should try to aim to get more people aware, but not only grassroots, at a grassroots level, but also people with influence. Maybe we can replicate the Sex Matters campaign in the US, but you know that they funded they were buying books by Helen Joyce in order to be given to the MPs. Maybe in the US you could do that with Cara's book and send it to the members of the House and the Senate. And here in Spain, we're trying to get to politicians. I'm in touch with some politicians. They are not that open, but they are listening, they are concerned, and raising awareness, getting in touch with people that are in position of influencing others, and very important, networking. Meeting with women is always a positive thing. Find your group, because individually we can do very little, but within a group we are much powerful, and it is much difficult to be like weakened, because this is a huge thing, and you can feel that your forces, that your strength is not enough to fight this very big thing. But if you're within a group, you're going to go much farther than on your own. So I think networking, raising awareness, and trying to reach people that could have a level of influence, maybe someone at the corporate level that could join a politician in a business dinner or something like that. Try to find your way to the people that are making the decisions. That's what I would advise.
What is the difference between the Izquierdas and Podemos on this? You can tell us how to pronounce.
Yeah, well, izquierdas, and that means left. So I don't know exactly to whom she's referring, because when we talk about izquierdas, partidos de izquierdas, that's left-wing parties, and really Podemos are the wokest of them all, like this was a fairy tale, but all of them are quite on board. So maybe Podemos is getting more absurd in their push, and maybe others will be more moderate. We feminists are against any of it, because really this could have disastrous consequences. But Podemos, I think, is just the intensity. They are behaving like they were in a cult. I don't know whether other parties could be talked to or convinced to moderate their stance. What we see is that Podemos are very focused. The Minister for Equality, she was asked at an interview on television, she was asked, what are non-binary people? And she said, non-binary people are non-binary people. She was so dignified in that nonsensical reply. I guess is that she couldn't answer, but probably she was told, you have to make the appearance that you understand it very deeply, and that's it. So it's very cultish. They do not have reasons. They do not explain anything. It's just they have a conviction, and they go for it.
Well, we're going to move on now to Tania Sturt. She's from New Zealand. She's been involved in gender identity politics for about 6 years. She's a founding member of Women's Liberation Aotearoa, and she's currently working in the architectural industry, but prior to that spent a decade in corrections, mainly as a probation officer with an interest in managing sex offenders. She's particularly interested in grassroots activism, and today Tania is so fantastic that it's the middle of the night in New Zealand, so has woken up specially to be with us. She's going to talk about the challenges and successes and the way forward for offline protesting and activism in New Zealand in regards to women's rights and gender identity ideology. So thank you so much, Tania, and over to you.
Yes, so I live in Wellington, but I was brought up and spent most of my life in Auckland, and Wellington is quite a woke area. Luckily we have quite a strong feminist movement here as well. Women's Liberation Aotearoa was founded in early 2020. We were a group of about 13 women who felt there was space for a feminist organisation in New Zealand that had a multi-issue approach to feminism. We're a left-wing organisation and we operate democratically within the group, which means that we vote on issues and there's no one spokesperson. We all have the ability to do whatever we need to do. We've got a membership of about 55 women now. So currently we're lobbying for women's rights in the prisons, particularly after recent reports of poor treatment that breached the Human Rights Act in the women's prison in Auckland. We also support the Nordic model in prostitution, we're anti-pornography, and we're concerned with issues of homelessness and poverty and male violence against women and children, which is something that New Zealand has a poor record in. Recently, we've spent a lot of time on gender critical ideology issues, necessarily because that's the largest threat to women's spaces and rights. Part of that was around when the government called for submissions for 2 bills before Parliament. Some of us individually and some of us represented Women's Liberation provided written and verbal submissions to the Select Committee. The 2 bills that were relevant to that were the Births, Deaths, Marriages, Relationships Registration Bill, which allowed people to change their sex on their birth certificates by self-identification, and the Conversion Practices Prohibition Legislation Bill, which seeks to criminalise anyone, including parents, for not actively affirming gender identity. Someone managed to look at the statistics on those submissions. There were submissions from all over New Zealand and some from overseas as well. And the statistics indicated that there were around 70% of submitters were against those bills. However, the recommendations, at least for the BDM bill, have been announced and it's likely to go ahead as planned. That's not particularly surprising given the reception that the submitters received from the panel. I think it was all over YouTube, some of the experiences people had, and it was fairly hostile reception to people who were anti the bill changes, and they were clearly quite biased. And it was frankly quite rude and dismissive, and it was pretty embarrassing for New Zealand to see some MPs acting like that. Ahead of us, we've got changes to surrogacy legislation, and we've got a hate speech bill coming up as well. So there'll be work around that we need to do. We work quite closely with Mana Wahine Korero, which is a group founded by Maori women who work towards protecting the mana or status of Maori women in New Zealand, and their principles align quite well with WLA. It's a newish group, but it's full of strong, very staunch women, and they're doing some great work. We also align with LAVA, which is Lesbian Action for Visibility in Aotearoa. And they've been around for quite a few years, and they've got a bit of a resurgence going on at the moment. And again, very strong, very supportive women doing a lot of really excellent work. Women's Lib supported their protest outside the Ministry for Women on International Women's Day this year, and that went quite well. WLA and Mana Wahine coordinated a national event for Suffrage Day in September. This went ahead in Dunedin and Wellington only, though it was meant to be in most of the main centres. We had some issues with COVID and lockdown, and Auckland were unable to participate in any meaningful way. Hopefully next year, things will be improving around the COVID situation, and we'll be hoping to get things up and going, and hopefully bigger and better next year as well. Because we're a small country in population and geography, really, we're relatively spread out. And so there are challenges around political actions. It's hard for people to get in touch with other women. It hasn't helped with lockdown issues. People can't move intercity. We can't support each other in person as much as we'd like. We also have sort of challenges around New Zealand being quite a laid-back culture. As a nation, we tend not to lean into conflict or overt emotion particularly easily. And it's combining that with the issues around being publicly out as gender critical means that it's difficult to get people involved in protests and public events and public actions. We know there are more people out there who see the fallacies of the gender identity movement. It's just getting in touch with them. And it's really, in my opinion, important to take it to the streets to try and get in touch with the general public. There are people sitting on the fence. There are people who it's not affecting, and they may have some discomfort around it, but they don't yet feel the need to speak up. We also have issues with media not giving us a platform, though we have had a couple of breakthroughs, not least of which when we were recently accused of criminal activity, and the media sought our comment on that, so we gave it to them. We didn't do it, by the way. The counter-protestings by the trans rights activists have been increasingly well organised over the last year. The International Women's Day protest had a group of counter-protesters of approximately the same size as us. It was relatively amicable. There was one woman who kicked off, started screaming at us, telling us we were all old and going to die soon, and she was very happy about that. Otherwise, it was fairly tame. A large group of trans protesters organised against the Speak Up for Women talks. Speak Up for Women is the largest feminist organisation in New Zealand, to my knowledge anyway. And they were quite loud, they were quite organised, and they had the loudspeakers and had speeches and things like that. They had shocking singing skills. I've got to say, you know, if you're going to sing 1960s protest songs, try to remember the words and the tune. That would really help. Just saying. The recent street actions, it became clear that they were getting more efficient, really. As soon as anything became public, they were immediately, any of our actions became public, they were immediately on the ball and organising counter-protests. The way forward, I think we're just going to keep doing what we can. It's hard to know what's going to happen in 2022. We've got COVID issues, as I said before, and we've got issues around protests around the mandated vaccines and things like that that may be taking precedence in the general public's eyes at the moment. We're just going to keep going and trying to build up the contacts and getting people involved, and that's really important.
The fact that your Prime Minister is a woman who is seen by the world, certainly in Hungary, as a feminist politician, as an example, does this have any effect on the laws like gender ID, surrogacy, etc.?
It doesn't appear to. We have tried many times to make contact with the Labour Party, the MPs in the Labour Party. They're just refusing to speak to us, that they don't really want to hear from us. There's not a lot coming from them. It's a hot potato politically, a lot of that feminist stuff, and they really don't want to say too much, particularly because the state of politics at the moment, she's got enough on her plate. There doesn't seem to be much interest.
What do the majority of lesbians or sort of traditional or feminists, sort of activist women in New Zealand, what's their position? Are they pro this gender ideology?
It seems to be pretty similar across the board. Yeah, I mean, I don't know every lesbian, obviously, but it does appear to be that there's more of an age divide. So the older generation is anti, and the younger generation, this is very generalised, and the younger generation are pro. So there's that division rather than sexual orientation or class even, really. It seems to be an age thing.
We'll move on to hearing from Cara now. So Cara Dansky is the president of the US chapter of Women's Human Rights Campaign. She served on the board of the Women's Liberation Front from 2016 until 2020. She's a longtime feminist, activist and lawyer, and also has extensive experience doing criminal justice reform research and advocacy. She's going to talk to us about her book, The Abolition of Sex, How the Transgender Agenda Harms Women and Girls. This is the book, and we'll hear from Cara, and then we can have some questions. Okay, over to you, Cara. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me on Feminist Question Time today to discuss my new book, The Abolition of Sex, How the Transgender Agenda Harms Women and Girls. I'm very happy to be here today to discuss parts of it. I'll start with a few of the endorsements because I'm so grateful to the women who gave them. First, from Leah Keith, the founder and board chair of the Women's Liberation Front. She says, once in a decade, there comes a book that breaks like dawn across a horizon of despair. The Abolition of Sex is that book. We are witnessing the complete destruction of the meaning of the word sex throughout the culture in general and the law in particular. The transgender movement would have us believe that sex does not exist as a material reality and should be replaced by the utterly incoherent concept of gender identity. They are winning. It is the grossest of understatements to say this is concerning. It is a vicious violation of women's basic human rights to put convicted rapists in women's prisons and teenage boys in girls' locker rooms. Women are losing our legal standing and every right that we have clawed out of patriarchy, while most people have no idea. It's also chilling to watch as we are robbed of the language for our bodies and our uniquely female experiences, and ultimately the only word that correctly names us, women. With steely calm and acute clarity, Cara lays bare what gender ideology is doing to women and what we might do to fight back. If you read one book this year, let it be this one, and then join Dansky on the barricades. Second, from Sheila Jeffries, co-author of the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights and author of Gender Hurts, among other books. Sheila says, I really enjoyed this book. The Abolition of Sex is a pellucidly clear exposition of the threat to women's rights that is posed by the politics of transgenderism. It is much needed because it is the first book to focus on what is happening in the US. Kara Dansky is to be congratulated. She is a trailblazer, and I expect her book to have considerable impact. Thank you both so much for your support and for your tireless commitment to advancing the sex-based rights of women and girls. Now I'd like to read some short sections of each chapter of the book. I'll jump around a bit, so this might seem a bit choppy, so please bear with me. A word of warning to the gender fragile. This book does not mince words. From the introduction, the transgender delusion, observations of a TERF. In March of 2021, a person named Rachel Levine was confirmed as the Assistant Secretary for Health at the US Department of Health and Human Services. Levine is a biological male who claims to be a transgender woman. During the confirmation hearings in February 2021, every single member of the United States Senate was expected to pretend that Levine is a woman. Every single member did so. No one was permitted to question this, and no one even tried. In October 19th, 2021, the Department of Health and Human Services announced that Levine had been sworn in as the first female 4-star admiral of the US Public Health Service Commission Corps. On the same day, the New York Times said the same thing on Twitter. The United States government and the New York Times outright lied to everyone by saying that Levine is female. This assault on women's sex-based rights is not occurring in a vacuum or by accident. It is being perpetrated by a vicious and brutal industry that operates openly and yet manages to sneak under the public radar. Its aim is to abolish sex in the law and throughout society. We are all victims of this assault, but those most harmed are women and girls, i.e. female human beings. Our society has simply not grappled with the implications of enshrining words like transgender and gender identity in law, policy, business, academia, and media. We need to start grappling with this. The time to do that is now. Here is the truth we cannot speak. Gender identity does not exist in any real material sense, and transgender is simply a made-up concept that is used to justify all kinds of atrocities. It is, in effect, a men's rights movement intended to objectify women's bodies and erase us as a class. It is left-wing misogyny on steroids. I say this as a leftist and a Democrat. At this point, many readers might be thinking, okay, but I have a child, sister, brother, niece, nephew, cousin, friend, etc., who is trans. What should I do about that? Just ignore his or her identity? My answer is this. Your child, sister, brother, niece, nephew, cousin, friend, or whomever is still either female or male biologically, even if the person has adopted a so-called trans identity. That is what matters. That is what is true in a material, real, objective sense. The person in question can adopt a subjective gender identity if she or he wants to, but that identity is no more real than it would be for you, me, or anyone else to identify as a tree or a chair. Along this journey, I have met numerous parents whose children, both minors and young adults, were struggling with matters of sex and gender. Many of these children appeared to believe that they were born in the wrong body and that they were in fact the opposite sex. Some simply wanted to escape their biological sex in search of something different. Today, such a phenomenon might seem healthy and normal. It is not. The parents I have met with trans children are in agony. The gender identity industry is feeding their children drugs that will result in permanent sterilization and possible terminal illness. It is subjecting them to surgeries that mutilate, amputate, and destroy healthy body parts. Most of these parents are unable to speak out because they have very legitimate concerns about their relationships with their children and about their children's privacy. So they sit and wait and hope while their children's lives and bodies are being destroyed. This book is for them. From chapter 1, What is a Woman? On July 28th, 2014, journalist Michelle Goldberg published a piece in The New Yorker titled, What is a Woman? The piece dealt with the growing rift between radical feminists and activists who claim that transgender is a meaningful concept. In it, she chronicled an event from 1973, where feminists were discussing the identities of men who claimed to be transsexuals, and where feminist Robin Morgan is reported to have stated this: I will not call a male she. 32 years of suffering in this androcentric society and of surviving have earned me the title woman. One walk down the street by a male transvestite, 5 minutes of his being hassled, which he may enjoy. And then he dares to think he understands our pain. No, in our mother's names and in our own, we must not call him sister. It is commonplace to say today, and to think we have to say, that trans women are women. But little thought is given to what this assertion actually means. When feminists question its meaning, we are told that trans women are women because they say that they are. Everyone in society is expected to go along with this fiction. What many people simply don't know, because most media outlets will not cover this topic, is that women, and some men, are routinely fired from jobs, ejected from organizations, banned from social media, and deplatformed from speaking engagements for having the temerity to say that women are female. Chapter 2, the abolition of sex. In this chapter, I go through all of the ways in which the US government, including Congress, the Biden administration, and the courts, is abolishing sex in the law. In all honesty, this chapter is probably too boring for many readers, especially readers outside the US. But the information has to be documented, and to the best of my knowledge, no one has yet brought together all of this material in one place. This chapter does that, and then concludes, abolishing sex as a meaningful category in the law has grave implications for everyone, but especially for women and girls, which will be explored in the next chapter. From chapter 3, implications for women and girls of abolishing sex. Our nation has not grappled with the long-term impacts of abolishing sex. For example, what will come of the reporting on crime and the recording of crime statistics if we continue to abolish sex? It has become commonplace for reporters to report on horrific crimes as being committed by women when they were in fact committed by men. One of the most egregious examples is the reporting on the case of Jacob Nieves, who was convicted in August 2020 of 2 counts of sexual exploitation of children, 1 count of distribution of child pornography, and 1 count of possession of child pornography. Jacob is a man who also claims to identify as a woman. Reports of the story frequently contain headlines, such as this one from the Eagle Tribune in North Andover, Massachusetts. Woman gets 30 years for child sexual abuse. The article clarifies that Nieves identifies and lives as a female without explaining what that might mean when referring to a man, and uses she and her in describing him. 2 of Nieves' victims were under 4 years old, and Nieves apparently told an undercover officer that she had sexually abused 2 children known to her, and sent the undercover agent images and videos that Nieves had produced, which depicted Nieves sexually abusing one of those children. This is a male child sexual abuser being reported on as though he were a woman in what is presumably an otherwise reputable publication. However, no reader would know that by simply reading the headline. Any average reader would simply assume that these horrible crimes had been committed by a woman. If we abolish sex, what will happen to our ability to conduct necessary public health research? Let's take a hypothetical example to illustrate this point. Let's say that a drug company is conducting a clinical trial of a new drug that has the potential to cure prostate cancer and is offering $500 to men who are willing to participate. I sign up on the basis of my supposed male gender identity. Remember, in a world where gender identity reigns supreme, the fact that I do not have a prostate is irrelevant. All that matters is that I claim to identify as a man. Under a legal regime that protects gender identity for all purposes, the drug company would be discriminating against me on the basis of my gender identity if it were to deny my participation in the trial. After I sign up, I complete all the necessary paperwork, ticking the box for M, and proceed to take the experimental drug. The drug company then tests the effects of the drug on my body and incorporates the results into its research. The company reports that all testing on men has been completed with positive results, and the drug is eventually approved. Would the men who later take the drug to cure their prostate cancer even know that at least one of the test participants was female? Wouldn't they have the right to? Shouldn't they? If readers think this sounds preposterous, that's because it is. And yet, in a world where sex is abolished at the altar of gender identity, there is no reason whatsoever that this could not happen or even become commonplace. The chapter then goes into detail about men in women's prisons, men in women's sports, and men in women's shelters. It describes the particular horrors that the abolition of sex is perpetrating on lesbians with input from the group LGB Fight Back. It then continues. When I speak with lesbians, gay men, and bisexual men and women, it is clear that transgenderism is fundamentally at odds with the legal rights and social acceptance of LGB people. There is nothing wrong with having a same-sex attraction, and all of transgender ideology obscures that reality. My hope in including their voices here is that readers will understand the impact of the gender identity industry on LGB people. I am immensely grateful to the members of LGB Fight Back who shared their insights and concerns with me. The simple fact is that all of this follows inevitably from the abolition of sex in law and policy. Our society simply cannot protect anyone on the basis of sex, women and girls, including lesbians especially, if we ignore that it exists. The situation is nothing but devastating for women and girls, and for lesbians in particular. From Chapter 4, the abolition of sex in media and discourse. The topics I have been discussing are not generally permitted to be talked about in public. When words like these are spoken, the speaker is often labeled hateful and bigoted, or sometimes racist, fascist, or Nazi. Explanations for these accusations are rarely provided. The closest anyone has ever come to justifying the accusation of racism is that insisting on single-sex bathrooms mirrors Jim Crow racial segregation. But that is ridiculous. Men and women are simply different for the purpose of using the restroom in ways that people of varying racial backgrounds are not different for that purpose. Most of the mainstream US news media has never provided any honest coverage of the feminist critique of gender identity. Whenever the mainstream media covers any story related to sex and gender, the coverage is biased. It is so biased, in fact, that it uses words like trans and transgender with the apparent assumption that everyone knows what those words mean, that they are uncontroversial, and that there is a coherent and shared definition of them. When headlines use phrases like trans athletes and transgender athletes, they are almost always referring to men and boys, but virtually no mainstream media outlet will say that. When they refer to healthcare for transgender people, they mean puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgeries that result in sterility and disease, but virtually no mainstream media outlet will say it. To most Americans, these headlines probably sound straightforward. In truth, they are anything but. The social media scene is no better. Posting feminist content has gotten numerous women and a few men suspended from Twitter and banned from Facebook. As noted earlier, Canadian journalist Megan Murphy, editor-in-chief of the Feminist Current, comedy author Graham Linehan, and Kelly J. Keane-Minshall have all been permanently banned, as have been numerous lesser-known feminists and male friends. Threats of violence in response to statements about sex and gender that ought to be completely innocuous have become routine. The mainstream media simply will not permit feminists to talk about our rights as women, because doing so is deemed to be offensive or hateful. The mainstream media keep us out by simply refusing to platform us. When we try to speak out on social media, we're subject to punishments, usually suspensions in the case of Facebook, and either temporary or permanent bans in the case of Twitter. The abolition of sex has become so entrenched in our society that we are not even allowed to talk about it using traditional modes of communication. I then go on to talk about various examples of professional silencing, including the stories of Kathleen Lowry, Holly Lawford Smith, Anna Kerr, Donna Hughes, and others. I talk about legal silencing of women, including the case of Scottish feminist Marion Miller. The chapter goes on to conclude that our language has changed so dramatically as to make the natural material reality of sex nearly invisible, with so little public debate, is astounding. And yet the abolition of sex in language, as in law and the media, is occurring so rapidly that it is difficult to discern. It has simply happened right before our eyes. And again, although this hurts everyone, it harms women and girls in particular. If we cannot talk about sex, we cannot talk about sexism. If we cannot talk about sexism, we cannot fight back against it. If we cannot fight against it, we will never achieve liberation. We're all on the losing end of this, but women and girls have the most to lose. If we do not take a stand, we will lose it all for certain. From Chapter 5, the gender identity industry. Why is this happening? Why are all three branches of the US government abolishing sex in the law? Why are women being forced to cede ground to and share spaces with men under the false pretense that they are female? Why are we not permitted to talk about this? Why are the media, which includes many smart and powerful women, misleading and gaslighting us? Why are women losing their jobs for stating that sex is real? An invisible industry exists that is driving this entire apparatus, and although it operates openly, few people seem to know about it. Obliterating biological sex in the law and throughout society is the starting point. Women's rights and bodies are collateral damage. The gender identity industry is grounded in a vicious blend of woman hatred, science denial, and greed. This statement may be shocking or outlandish. Please bear with me as I explain. I then go on to talk about Janice Raymond's fantastic 1979 book, The Transsexual Empire, and her introduction to the 1994 republication. I discuss extensively the emergence of so-called queer theory in US academia, and then I continue. How did an obscure and nonsensical academic theory go from the ivory tower to everyone's living rooms, classrooms, boardrooms, and throughout society itself? I would argue that once the academy succeeded in queering the sex binary, three things happened that would create the necessary conditions for the contemporary abolition of sex in law and throughout society. One, the invention of the word transgender. Two, the explosion of corporate-driven technologies and medical practices. And three, the thorough embrace of the sexual exploitation of women and girls on the political left. If someone had tried to sell Americans the idea that sex isn't real by quoting some harebrained scheme cooked up by a handful of off-the-wall academics, it never would have succeeded. Everyone, after all, knows how babies are made. In order to accomplish the goal of persuading Americans to go along with the pretense that sex doesn't exist, we needed a new word. That magic word is transgender. The chapter goes into detail about the industry, including Stryker, Arcus, and Rothblatt. Most viewers will know who I'm talking to, and goes into detail about Jen Billick's fantastic blog, the 11th Hour blog. Then, from the section on the sexual objectification of women. The truth is that the pitiful ways in which women are treated are all right out there in the open. They are evident in the ways in which men catcall us, the ways in which we are depicted in imagery throughout society, the ways in which we are sexually harassed and abused, the ways in which we are objectified, and in pornography. Gender identity does not erase any of it. In fact, gender identity makes the objectification of women much, much worse, because the objectification of women is the essence of what gender identity is. Sexual objectification of women is not new, and feminists have been fighting it for centuries. What is relatively new is the evolution of the view that women exist solely for sexual and reproductive purposes into the notion that woman isn't a meaningful category of human beings at all, but rather a concept, a figment of a man's imagination. If anyone can be a woman, then no one is a woman. And if a man can claim to exist as a woman by simply announcing that he is one, that is a complete mockery of womanhood. The very concept of the transgender woman is the ultimate expression of the denial of women's humanity. The simple truth is that women are female and men are male. The gender identity industry is working hard to obscure that truth in furtherance of its goal of abolishing sex. Don't let them get away with it. From the conclusion, the global campaign to protect women's sex-based rights. It is my hope that readers of this book will embrace the seriousness of this issue and join the global campaign to protect our hard-fought rights as women in the face of this pernicious assault. Pernicious because it poses as a movement of liberation, and indeed as an extension of the movement to liberate women. WHRC USA sees clearly that all of these efforts to abolish sex throughout the law and society are having a devastating impact on women and girls, and we will not stop fighting them. We will never give up, and we hope that you will join us. If you want to get involved in the fight against the abolition of sex, please sign the Declaration of Women's Sex-Based Rights. All of humanity depends on it.
This is a really, really good book, and partly it's because Cara is a lawyer and she talks in the heart of the book, at the center, about the legal situation, what's happening in the law in the United States, which is replicated all over. But it's a a lovely read because Cara is really good at writing about the law. I mean, she's really good at writing, but fantastic about the law. So you get an insider's view and you get an understanding of what's happening in the law and those changes. But it's a sort of very confident analysis, because I guess you've read, Cara's written so much. Another thing that I love about the book, and I think others here who other women and men who read it, is that Cara is a radical feminist, and she's rooted in the radical feminist movement, and she has been for a very long time. And unlike some of the other books that have been written about this devastating sort of rolling out of transgender ideology, which start off saying things like, I never really even thought of myself as a feminist, and none of us saw this coming. We had no idea, and we don't understand why it's happening. This book is completely different from that. Cara does understand why it's happening, and has some theories about it, which towards the end, in the sort of last but one chapter, she articulates them really well. And one of the reasons she understands it is because of being rooted in this community of radical feminists who've been thinking about this for years, and we have a good analysis. So I would say for those things, Cara's a lawyer, she's a radical feminist, and she's great at writing. That's my main summary. It's definitely a great book. I also feel really grateful that Cara's written it, because I feel like she's speaking for us. And I also feel as if we've been working together, partly through these webinars, but in radical feminist meetings and discussions, on working out sensible and appropriate responses to this threat that's happening. And I feel this is the best articulation of our views, as well as just Cara. So I sort of feel very emotional because I feel like I can absolutely wholeheartedly buy loads of copies of this book and give them to people without having to say, oh, but I don't agree with the language, and they don't really have a feminist analysis, and it's really annoying that they don't quote anybody. That brings me on to a really fantastic thing about the book, is that Cara quotes many radical feminists in the book, and roots her analysis in that. So she's read, she knows about the community, she knows what we've been thinking. So one, which just explains what's actually happening. So one of the people she quotes near is Fry's birdcage analogy. And Cara's talking about why gender confines us and how it confines us. So she uses that or explains the Fry's birdcage analogy. And then she goes on to talk about Sheila Jeffrey's writing on gender, and quotes just in a very sort of intertwined way a lot of the great feminist thinkers that we've had, and is informed by them, which is very nice. Unlike some of the books where it's almost as if radical feminist doesn't exist, and if they mention it, it will be very, very sort of cursory mention once. But this is much better, and so it's possible that you'll find you want to follow up at some of the other books that come up in this. Now, another thing that so it's not just radical feminists, it's also other important books. So Cara quotes Abigail Shrier's book, and sort of points out that that's also a useful book. So it's sort of quite good talking about what's been happening in the States. Cara's language is unbelievably accurate in this book. It's fantastic. She's unequivocal about her insistence and our insistence that you can't change sex, and that we need to call men men. It's men getting into women's changing rooms. It's boys and young men, or men in women's sports. They're not anything else. And it becomes very, very clear. So that's a fantastic thing about the book. There's some new stuff that is in there that I sort of feel like we're going to want to quote, and I was picking out thinking that's a fantastic quote. So one of the things that I haven't heard before or seen is this idea that Cara writes, in 2014, a friend opened my eyes to the problems of the transgender agenda, telling me that transgender is anti-feminist because it is, in her words, the ultimate penetration of our bodies by men. Now, there are loads of bits in the book where I thought, oh, that's interesting. I haven't heard that written in that way, and it's really clear. So that's very helpful. Now, just sort of a bit later in the book, Cara quotes the 1973 work by Robin Morgan, which I think maybe you just quoted, saying, "I will not call a male she. 32 years of suffering in this androcentric society and of surviving have earned me the title woman. One walk down the street by a male transvestite, 5 minutes of his being hassled, and then he dares to think he understands our pain. No, in our mother's names and in our own, we must not call him sister." Now, there's loads of quotes that Cara's picked out, and there it's a really great read. Plus also I'll say it's very fun to read, so, and uplifting. So that's another reason to read it. On the Equality Act, Cara calls it the so-called Equality Act being introduced into the United States. She says the bill is long and difficult to pass for lawyers and non-lawyers alike. Its stated purpose is to prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex, gender identity, and sexual orientation, and for other purposes. And then Cara riposts and says, this is disingenuous, however, because what it would actually do is redefine sex to include gender identity throughout US civil rights law. So that's good. I've got a question, Cara. You were saying that when the book was actually published, there were a couple of bits, or at least one bit that the editor put in that you were not that happy with. Can you tell us about that?
First of all, I will say that the process of getting this book published happened incredibly quickly. I've never published a book before, so I don't know how long it usually takes. But this started in about May of this year, and it's already out. And my understanding is that's unbelievably fast for a publication. So, and part of the reason for that is that when the publisher first contacted me, he understood that this was a major issue, and he thought that I would be a good person to write this book. And we sort of talked over the months and settled on the idea for the book. And I submitted the first manuscript in August. And we sort of went back and forth, and that was all fine. And the original agreed on publication date was going to be sometime in December. But as August wore on, and September wore on, and October wore on, we saw some crazy things that were happening, and I cover all of these in the introduction, the ACLU completely editing women out of one of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's most important quotes about abortion rights on the anniversary of her death, which was so outrageous. And then we've got, leaders of the Labour Party saying absolutely insane things about cervixes, and women running around London dressed as dinosaurs. And the Lancet reduced us to bodies with vaginas. Everything was just looking like it was speeding up. And so I kept urging the publisher to move up the publication date, and he kept kind of putting me off. But then Dave Chappelle happened. And for anyone who doesn't know, Dave Chappelle had a comedy special on Netflix where he speaks up in support of J.K. Rowling and says that he's joining Team TERF. And that was a game changer for those of us fighting this fight in the US, because he's just huge here. You can't really exaggerate his popularity. So finally, I sent it to the publisher and I said, we've got to do this. And then he agreed with me. So that was good. So he agreed to push up the publication date. And that had two impacts that I want to address. And I promise I'll get to your point, Joe. One impact it had is that that's the main reason it's on Amazon. I've had a lot of people say, I can't buy this book because I can't buy anything off Amazon. I just want to say, I totally understand that. Some people have said, I don't buy anything from Amazon, but I will make an exception for this book, which I appreciate. But I also totally understand if people just can't buy it off Amazon. I get it. But the original plan had been to go the more traditional route and print a bunch of copies and ship them to distributors and advertise it for pre-order, which is typically what happens. But this had to move quickly. And so he made the editorial decision, not editorial, but the publishing decision. And this was his decision. I ultimately contractually couldn't decide this. It was his call to make. And he decided, we need to go. We need to finish this. We need to get it up on Amazon, and it just needs to go. So I said, fine. I didn't have a say anyway, but I was fine with it. But then what happened is it just really sped up the editing process. And so I submitted what I thought was the final at the end of October. And so when this went up this past week, they sent me the PDF. And my final had updated the introduction to include the stuff on Chappelle. So here's what I said to update everyone on Chappelle. In October 2021, Netflix released a Dave Chappelle comedy special called The Closer, in which he offered support to J.K. Rowling before announcing that he is Team TERF. This set off a firestorm of debate about whether Dave Chappelle was transphobic. Commentator Bill Maher would later declare on television that he is Team Dave and called for having an honest, free discussion about this. And I sort of left it at that. I thought that was enough. The publisher, I think, had a good instinct, which was to expand on that and sort of hype up the Dave Chappelle stuff. So what he did, and he tells me that when he did this, he assumed that I would have another review of it, but I didn't. So he just edited it to say, in October 2021, Netflix released a Dave Chappelle comedy special called The Closer, in which he offered support to J.K. Rowling before announcing that he is Team TERF. And here's what he added. He also made provocative jokes about trans people and boldly mocked the pretense that a man can become a woman or vice versa by simply declaring it so, and then going on with the rest. I would never, ever say that Dave Chappelle made provocative jokes about trans people. I also wouldn't say that he boldly mocked the pretense that a man can become a woman, because I actually don't think that's bold. I think saying a man cannot become a woman is not bold at all. We should all be saying that. But I would never say that Dave Chappelle made provocative jokes about trans people, because I would never say trans people. That's part of the point of this entire book, is that we have to stop using that language. And it's just interesting to me because this publisher is totally on board with this project and has been since the beginning. He never told me once that I had to change a pronoun or use wrong sex pronouns or refer to men as women or anything. He's completely on board with this project. And yet, when sort of rushed to finish this book, he included that phrase, trans people, and he himself would never use it. Or maybe he would, and that's part of the problem. The language is so pernicious that even someone who was completely on board with this project messed up at the last minute and it got slipped into the version. So the version that many of you have will include that, but I emailed him and I basically demanded an edit. So any book that gets printed after this past Thursday will not include that language, but any book that was printed on Wednesday will.
How long did it take you to write that book?
That book was almost already written in my head. I mean, the specific answer is from sometime in May until August 1st. So basically the last half of May and July. One thing that sort of happened to make it possible is that you're right in saying that I did participate in writing the amicus briefs that Wolf submitted in some of the cases that I mentioned. And for that reason, it's just very easy for me to bring up the briefs on my laptop. So I can very easily quote Wolf because I know exactly where to find all the material. There's a part that I didn't read where I talk about crime statistics and how the skewing of sex could potentially impact our society's ability to even know what male violence against women is. So I go into depth about that. And I just know, because I know from my history of doing criminal justice work, that all of that information is compiled in something called Table 42 of the Uniform Crime Report. But there's no reason that most people will know that. I just happen to know that. So it's very easy for me to just pull that up and write a section on crime reporting. So most of it was in my head. It was a matter of getting it out of my head and onto the page.
Do you have any translations planned?
Not at the moment. I mean, there's just, the whole process was just too fast to ask that question. I would love it, but there's nothing planned at this time.
I very seldom read books. I don't really like reading. I listen to books and then I say to people, oh, I've just read this book, but I actually just listen to it on Audible. Would you be able to do that? Because I think that there are a lot of women and I guess men who would find that really attractive.
Yeah, so I got asked that question a lot on Wednesday when it first came out. And I hadn't spoken with the publisher about it, but I did. I asked him and he said, yes, absolutely. And he said, well, we'll figure out a way to make that happen. So I don't have a timing, but yes, that'll happen.